This week on Q&A, columnist and political commentator Patrick Buchanan. He served as a speechwriter and senior advisor to President Nixon and joins us to discuss his book, Nixon's White House Wars, the battles that made and broke a president and divided America forever.
Pat Buchanan, in the acknowledgments of your new book on your time with Richard Nixon, you write, "This memoir and history of the Nixon presidency is surely among the last to be written by a confidant who served in the White House from its first to its final days over 4 decades ago." How many others are left?
I'm sure there's some of the young men around Nixon, what we were called back in those days, like Dwight Chapin and others, who haven't written memoirs yet, but I'm not sure they're going to. But I do think in terms of a written memoir, this is, Brian, this is probably the last of someone who was right there and knew it from the beginning.
What did you put in this book that you had never talked about before?
Well, I put in the origins of the Agnew speech, my memos on that. There's a number of memos in there that I went to my files and got out that I've never published before, a great number of them. And there's a description of how I almost defected on the China trip. I was so unhappy with it. And there's also the end of it, you know, where you put in that quote by John Osborne, and it looked so. He said he had seen Shelley and me when first day, the inauguration day in '69, looking up at the portico, and then he had seen how it had all ended. He was an old liberal curmudgeon, and he said it almost breaks your heart. So there's all of this is fresh and new, almost all of it. Most of the memoranda have never been published. Others have gotten parts of them. But what that's about is really what it was like as a young conservative in the Nixon White House, trying to do battle for your beliefs and the opposition you faced and the transition the party was undergoing, and frankly how Nixon sort of held the whole thing together until the Watergate collapsed it.
You mentioned Spiro Agnew and the Des Moines speech. We've got a clip of it. Before we go there, what was it? What role did it play? What led up to it?
Here's what happened. Nixon, toward the end of his first year, the massive demonstrations, the new mobilization, and the moratorium were being held on the monument grounds. And it was quite clear, Time and Newsweek were saying Richard Nixon's presidency is in danger of being broken. David Broder, a liberal columnist, wrote that, the breaking of the president. And I wrote the president a memo saying, you've got to stand up, and we're going to have to explain to the country why we have to keep those kids over there fighting and dying in Vietnam. And Nixon gave his famous great silent majority speech on November 3rd, 1969. It was a smashing triumph. And 70% of the country backed him and stood with him. But that night, after the speech finished, the networks had proceeded to trash it. The 3 major networks, and most Americans got their news about the country and about the president and the world from these 3 networks. And Nixon was angry, and Haldeman told me to write letters and telegrams and things, and I said, this is the time really to take on the networks directly, openly, and at a high level. The way to do it is a speech by the Vice President of the United States, which I will write. And it came back, a memo, which is photograph of it is in that book, where Haldeman wrote back, P has seen, go ahead. That means the President of the United States has seen your memo, go ahead and start writing that speech. And I wrote it for about 3 or 4 days. I was in touch with the Vice President, and I went through 3 drafts, which is not a great number, and I was called over to the Oval Office, and there sat the President with his glasses on, which he never wore, coat and tie, sitting there at the desk, editing my words and writing in phrases into this Agnew speech. And then he murmured, and I was listening, and he murmured, "This'll tear the scab off those bastards." And I broke out laughing, and he broke out laughing. And Agnew went out to deliver that speech in Des Moines at some meeting gathering, a Midwest conference in Des Moines. And I got word in the White House, or in the EOB where I worked, that ABC was going to go live with it. And I was nervous, so I went up to the University Club and went swimming. And they called me out from the pool, And they said, Pat, NBC and CBS are going live with it. And I said to myself, this is either going to be a great success or a career ender. And Agnew delivered that speech on the networks, and the reaction was sensational. Nationwide, telegrams, letters. What we realized is the whole country stood with us in its sentiment about the networks and about television. And then that night, if you can believe it, I drove out to Andrews Air Force Base at about 3 a.m. and got aboard Air Force Two. Agnew had invited me to ride with him down to Cape Canaveral. And he comes on the plane late, and he comes over to me and says, gangbusters. And it was just a phenomenal moment. And that moment, I think, Nixon's great silent majority speech, Agnew's attack on the networks at Des Moines, and the follow-up attack on the Washington Post and New York Times in Montgomery, Alabama, which I wrote with the vice president. That, I think, was the real making of the president. Not 1968 so much, but the real making of the president. If you can believe it, Brian, at the end of that year, Richard Nixon was at 68% approval and 19% disapproval. Astonishing. Here was a fellow who 7 years before was the biggest loser in American politics after he'd lost the governorship of California to Pat Brown.
Let's see a little bit of that speech of Ted Agnew, the former vice president, November 13th, 1969, in Des Moines.
Now, every American has a right to disagree with the President of the United States and to express publicly that disagreement. But the President of the United States has a right to communicate directly with the people who elected him. And the people of this country have the right to make up their own minds and form their own opinions about a presidential address without having the President's words and thoughts characterized through the prejudices of hostile critics before they can even be digested.
Do I remember that happened right around dinner hour, or 6 or 7 at night?
It was around 7 or 7:30, I believe, at night, maybe 7 o'clock at night. That's correct. And what Agnew is talking about there is the fundamental point, and it exists today, is that the President of the United States, in those days, a number of people had custody of how and what would be seen of the President of the United States and how it would be presented, because they controlled all three networks. I would say 12 people would make this decision. And so they, in effect, the direct communication between President and the people, they were standing right in the middle of it. They had the lens. They would present it as they saw fit, in what excerpts they saw fit. And we felt we almost couldn't live with this. And the president was constantly on the phone and things and calling for letters to the editors and telegrams. I said, this is nonsense. I mean, you were seen by 50 million people. The network fellows commenting on it were seen by 50 million people. And, we can't turn this around with letters to the editor. And so we elevated that issue. And the issue exists to this day. And I think that was the first strike.
Why did they decide at the time to carry it live? Because they would never do this in those days.
Well, I think because, we put in phrases at the end, whether what I say tonight is heard by the American people doesn't depend on you or doesn't depend on me. They decide what you hear and don't hear. And that was exactly right, and it was a challenge. Also, I think, as I recall in there, we had a quote from Frank Reynolds of ABC, had written this horrible thing, or said this horrible thing on television during the campaign of '68, which just astonished me, saying Nixon's retaining his ability to hit his people with a meat axe. Nixon's controlling himself. And so we had quotes and things like that, which were a challenge and defiance of them, and in effect, goaded them into putting it out there. I think they put it on the air because they thought that Agnew, who was being trashed as sort of, an individual, a brutish individual who had no sensitivity and didn't understand the First Amendment, that they thought that the public would say, my goodness, these Nixon people want to censor the news and restrict the First Amendment. But the American people loved it. It was the real making of Vice President Agnew, who before that, as you know, in 1968 had been regarded by the press as something of a buffoon.
But you write a lot about Spiro Agnew in the book. What impact did it have on you when you found out that he was taking cash money in envelopes in the old executive office
I went
building?
up to the EOB. He had a press conference at room 450 in the EOB. And there were these reports and rumors that he was being investigated by George Bell, who was a friend of mine over in Baltimore, the U.S. attorney. And I went up and watched Agnew make a defiant statement and have the press in 450. And then Ron Ziegler, the press secretary, seemed to undercut Agnew. So I called Al Haig. I said, Al, what is going on? Why are we not standing by the vice president? He said, come on over, Pat. And I went into his office, the chief of staff of the corner office that Haldeman had, and he said, we've got him taking envelopes in the basement. And I was shattered by this. And Agnew was a good friend of mine. I traveled with him in '70. I liked him. We were buddies. He had real courage. And he was just a terrific fellow. You had a lot of fun with him. And Bryce Harlow, you could play tricks on the guy, and he really enjoyed it. And I think I was really agonized and disappointed with that. And I remember writing him a note the day he resigned.
Did you ever talk to him after that?
I didn't talk about what happened and why. I assumed they had the goods on him when he played Nolo Contendere. But I'll tell you, John Damgard, who was an aide, used to, whenever Agnew came to town once every year or two, he would call a number of Agnew's close friends, and a quiet meeting. Bryce Harlow would be in there, and the folks from Agnew's shop, Goodall and Buchanan, and everybody would have a couple of drinks and talk about the great days. He was fun to travel with, I'll tell you.
There are a lot of different things you touch on, and I'm going to jump around, but before we do that, I want to ask you to do something that I don't think I've ever heard you do. I want you to talk about your brothers and sisters, because there are 8 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned a couple. You mentioned Henry in here. You mentioned Crick in here. And we know Pat Buchanan. But how old are they? How many of them are still alive? Mm-hmm. Where do you fit in the family? And what do they do?
Well, my 2 oldest brothers, Bill died when he was about 45, and so my brother Hank died a couple of years ago. So I'm the oldest now of 9, and my brother Crick, the one who served in Vietnam, he's got 6 kids, and he's a dentist, and he's living out in Maryland, Montgomery County. Below him is, in age, is my sister Kathleen, who worked for Bill Kristol for a while, and then worked up in the vice president's shop, I believe, Vice President Quayle. And she's got 3 kids now, and has lost a kid, and she's and then below her is my brother John Edward Buchanan, who's coaches basketball and who's been an accountant and is a corporate business executive out in I think he's out in Kensington now, lives still in Kensington.
Maryland, right out here.
Kensington, Maryland, yeah. And then there's Bay, who's a General MacArthur, who ran my campaign, who's a tough customer. She, incidentally, she really was high on Romney, and she became a Mormon. She's very high on Romney in 2012, and when that was over, I think she was disillusioned by it and got out of politics and is now in real estate and doing very, very well.
Where does she live?
She lives out in Oakton, Virginia, which is a little beyond Tyson's Corner. And then there's my brother Brian, who went down to Bedford once he got out of medical school. He's a doctor down in Bedford, Virginia, which is down near between Roanoke, Lynchburg, and sort of up in the hills there. It's got that famous World War II memorial, where all those guys from Bedford coming ashore on Omaha Beach were just wiped out. And then there's my brother Tom, who's a managing partner at Winston Strawn. He's a lawyer. He lives on Gerald Ford Drive over in right near Episcopal High School, where Johnny McCain went to school. So he's doing extremely well, and so that's where they are and what they're doing. But we all grew up in D.C. I was in D.C. I was born in D.C. My mother used to work as a nurse at Providence Hospital, at the old Providence Hospital, and born and raised up in Blessed Sacrament Parish, the D.C. side of, they call it Chevy Chase, D.C., and went to school at Blessed Sacrament, nuns only, Gonzaga High School, right up the street. Buchanan Family Field is the name of the football field. And went to Georgetown on the 5-year plan.
I remember you getting kicked out of Georgetown.
That's I told you, I've got the story in the book. When I got aboard the plane with Agnew, and somebody got aboard after me, and I looked over, and it was Father Joseph Sellinger, the head of Loyola College or University at the time, and he looked at me, and there was instant recognition, because Father Joe Sellinger had expelled me from Georgetown University after an altercation with the police when I was a senior in October of 1959. And this was dug up by Jack Anderson's deputy, Britt Hume, when I was in the White House writing speeches about how these kids, if we got to crack down on student disorders. And Britt Hume called me up and says, Pat, I want to read you something here. It says that you were arrested and this is what you were charged with. You're out on $2,000 bond and all of this. What do you have to say for yourself and fight with the police? I said, well, Britt, I was ahead on points until they brought out the sticks. It's one of my better lines when you have no defense.
Mom and Dad what were they like?
Well, my father was very much the autocrat, very autocratic. He was as I mentioned right from the beginning, an earlier book, his three political heroes were Joe McCarthy, General MacArthur, and General Francisco Franco of Spain, the Catholic who finished off the communists in Spain. He was a very devout Catholic. He went to Gonzaga before I did. He came off out of a broken family. His father had left him, and the Jesuits came by and got him when he graduated from Holy Trinity, which was Jack Kennedy's church. It was an Irish neighborhood in those days, and they brought him down to Gonzaga, and so when he raised 9 kids, and my mother was out of the Mon Valley. You know these towns you saw that Trump was visiting, Manessa and Charleroi, Belle Vernon. I used to go up there after the war. My mom was one of 8 kids, and all 4 of her younger brothers fought in the European Theater of Operations, and they were in the Mon Valley. And some of my cousins were telling my sister Bay, because they get together, that Bay, there's nothing up here in the Mon Valley but Trump signs. And that's where Trump won the election in Pennsylvania. Out there, and take that corner, that southwest corner of Pennsylvania, take the eastern part of Ohio. I've been up there, Weirton, that steel mill and everything in West Virginia. That's where he won the election.
There's a quote in your book from Richard Nixon that says, I've never seen an extremist like you who has a sense of humor.
Well, that's...
Something like, where did he say that?
Well, I challenged George H.W. Bush, came off Crossfire, a talk show, 10 weeks before the New Hampshire primary in '72, and my sister and I went up to challenge the President of the United States in the New Hampshire primary. And when we got up there, the polls showed Bush at about 65-70%, Buchanan at 16%, and David Duke at 6% in the polls. And so then we ran a really tough campaign against Bush up there, stayed up there constantly, and we'd closed the gap from 50 or some points, and we closed it to the gap to 17 or 15 points. It was 51-37, something like that. And it was a tremendous victory, a moral victory, and the press played it up huge, and we went to Georgia and did almost as well. But then we had Super Tuesday, and there was 8 primaries on Super Tuesday, and I got wiped out in every single one. And so Nixon was in New Jersey, and so I'd lost 10 in a row. So I called Nixon in New Jersey, the president, and I said, Mr. President, 10 for 10, not bad, eh? And he said, Buchanan, you are the only extremist I know with a sense of humor. And then he said, okay, come on up and bring Shelley and bring your Secret Service detail. So it was a very pleasant visit I had with him, with the old man, and that's 92. That was just 2 years before he died. Just before he died, I called him up in New Jersey, and I said, sir, we haven't talked. And he said, Pat, I'm coming down to D.C. He would come down, and the hotel was it on Washington Hotel. It's on that circle
on
over
DuPont Circle.
No, it's over toward Georgetown.
One Washington Circle.
Yeah, exactly. And he would come down there, and he was really so alert and everything. And you sit down just where you are, like, okay, what's he doing? What's he commenting about everybody? What's up? Who's down? And it was like the first time I met him. He was so interested his whole life in politics and personalities and issues. He was consumed by this. And I've thought of it from January '66 when I met him till about the Oregon primary. I was a principal one in there for 3, 4, 5 hours a day in his office. In the White House, it became Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and then when they were gone, it became Ziegler and Al Haig. But the old man almost needed to have that, talking constantly, exploring this issue, that issue, what do you think, calling you back in. And it's a feature I didn't, my wife was with the vice president when he was vice president, but
Nixon.
With Nixon was vice president, but I don't know whether Bob Finch, who was close to him then, was in there like that. But I've noticed that was a characteristic of him.
But you're sitting across the desk from him. You say in the book you had a 3-hour interview chat with him before he hired you back in 1966.
Right.
How old were you?
I was 26. It's December. I was just turned 27.
What was that like?
Well, it was. I mean, it was not a hard interview for me because he was asking me about issues.
And you were doing what at the time?
I was an editorial writer at the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. I got a lucky break 6 weeks out of journalism school. I went back and applied for an opening there. And the editorial editor said, okay, you can write some editorials until we hire the replacement for the guy that left. And I was really working so hard that they kept me in and they moved the other editorial writer out. So we had 2 editorial writers at the Globe-Democrat. The Post-Dispatch down the street had about 6 or 7. And so I was writing immediately on every issue, local, statewide, things I was initially unaware of, foreign policy, domestic, everything. So, and I've been doing this for 3.5 years and writing other pieces as well. So when President Nixon would ask me about various things in this 3-hour meeting, I mean, I was all set on it, and so I rolled it right off, passed the oral exam with flying colors. And he said after the 3 hours, he said, I would like to hire you for 1 year. And he said, here's the reason. I want you to help write the column I've got to write once a month. Get this mail, get that piled down, do some press work, do the other things right outside my office. And he said 1 year because I'm going to go out and campaign for all the Republicans in '66. And if we don't get back some of these massive losses we got in the Goldwater campaign, a nomination in '68 is not going to be worth anything. And so Nixon predicted we were going to win 40 seats in the House and 6 or something, whatever, the Senate. And the returns came in. We won 47 in the House. This was November 1966, and we were on our way to the White House.
When did you see him in his angriest moment for you? And how did he react when he was angry?
Well, Nixon he never yelled at me. He never yelled at me. If he got angry, he would yell sort of generically at the wall or sort of, why can't I get some people to do these things? I mean, but again, I can't recall him really enraged at me, or just maybe, I don't know why, but in the book, I don't think I have recollections. I don't have great recollections of him being enraged, but I will say this. It was different. I worked for Reagan. And I remember Reagan coming into the cabinet room, and I don't know why, he looked at me and he says, that, damn Tip O'Neill, and exploded. And I was at Reykjavik, and he exploded after Reykjavik when he came out of that meeting with Gorbachev. I was at the embassy. Nick Ruey, who was a friend of mine, I'm sure a friend of yours, was the ambassador. And Reagan came out, he was waving around human events, which had denounced the summit, I think, and he was but Reagan had this, what I consider a healthy temper, sort of exploded like this storm. And by the time we were coming home from Reykjavik on that plane at night, Tony Dolan and I, we were laughing and celebrating the fact that we didn't get any deal at Reykjavik. And Reagan came back and he was in wonderful spirits. Pat, you're at the time when Jimmy Stewart and I, and telling stories. But President Nixon kept it inside himself and he brooded. And I mean, when he would call you at night and he was angry at something, the voice was low. I want you to do this, do that, and go after them. And he'd let these things get to him in a way that I don't think President Reagan did. As I say, I think there's a certain healthy thing of sort of an anger and then getting it out of the system, and that's the real difference between the two.
During the Nixon administration and the Watergate, Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, Jeb Magruder, Chuck Colson, they all went to prison. They testified. Dwight Chapin, you testified. I've got a little piece of video from your testimony. You say that you had your brother sit behind you.
Right.
Why?
My brother Crick. Well, I'd watched all the others up there, and they all had these lawyers sitting beside them. You know, and as soon as you say it, you say the guy's got a lawyer. He's got a problem. He must have done something. You got some lawyer advising him. And I didn't believe I'd done anything wrong. But I did need somebody, you know, just to be with you. So I called my brother Crick up on the day I was going to testify, and I called him the day before. I said, can you come over to the Watergate where I live with Shelley? And we'll go to the White House and get breakfast, and then we're going to head up to that big committee hearing room where John F. Kennedy announced for president. Famous, yeah. And he came up, and I said, I don't need you to sit at the table with me, but I want you to sit right behind me. And in the book, I think I've got a picture, and it's got my brother right behind me there, and that's what he did. And when they would take a break, he would go back in this room with me, and then we'd come back out to the hearing, in and out. And so, yeah, I just, you wanted your brother there. I didn't need a lawyer.
This video, I'm not sure it's your brother behind you in this video that we have, but let's run it and you can tell us if you know who this person was.
The President had conducted an administration for 4 years that had won the confidence or support of millions of Democrats. The President's stand upon the issues of defense and welfare, upon taxes and government, upon coercive integration and busing, were closer to what the American people wanted than those of his opponents. But we won as well, Mr. Chairman, because of the quality and the character of our candidate. If one looks back over the political history of this country, there's only one other man, other than Richard Nixon, who has been his party's nominee for president or vice president 5 times. That is Franklin Roosevelt.
In those days, you couldn't put a camera in front of you, so we couldn't see you frontally. That's not your brother.
No, that's not my brother. But there's a picture in the book of my brother right behind me. You can see it sort of cut off about there, but he was right there. I could hear him laughing at times.
Did you ever think in this process that you would go to prison?
No, I didn't. I'd never hired a lawyer. I went over to, as I told folks, you know, I've been to before grand juries. I was called over by the special prosecutor. I thought they were a vindictive, very hostile crowd. They tried to get you involved in the dirty tricks operations. They tried to, as Sam Dash did at that hearing. But to be honest, I thought Sam Dash just didn't understand politics. I mean, we had phrases he was reading to me. He was appalled. I said, one of them was Ed Muskie, and Nixon had told us we have to go after Muskie, and I agreed, and I had done this analysis. I said, it's time to go down to the kennels and let all the dogs loose on a college ed. And so Dash reads this and says, can you explain this to me? And I said, look, Gary Hart said if the Nixon people underestimate us, we'll do what we did to Humphrey, we'll kill him. And I said, I don't think he had physical violence in mind, that the exaggerated metaphor is the staple of American politics. But, you know, it came off very well. I will say those 5.5 hours, I got back to, was it Nolan of the Boston Globe?
Marty Nolan.
Marty Nolan said when Buchanan got back to the EOB, it was like Orly Field after Lindbergh landed. You know, it was a great day in a way because it boosted the morale of the whole White House staff, which was very down. And the good news was that the networks decided after I had testified for 5 hours, they're no longer carrying live testimony.
Here you are on your way to China.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you'd stopped in Hawaii yet. You're on Air Force One with the president, and want to ask you eventually about the trip back. Let's watch this.
Most interesting on the Chinese. Your comments before about Mao and Zhou and Malraux's anti-memoirs were most interesting. You know?
Yeah, and read the first part too. His talk about really the more interesting part is his evaluation of de Gaulle. It's rather fascinating.
That's great footage. I don't recall ever seeing that.
What was in your mind as you were making the trip?
Well, I guess we were talking about a book by Andre Malraux. I think we were, yeah.
But I mean, what was in your mind as you were on that plane?
Well, I'd sent Nixon a memo telling him I thought it was taking a real risk taking this trip, and then I sent him a second memo saying I think you have to take me along. It's my turn, and Buchanan is a conservative. I'll give you cover there, because the conservatives look to me sort of to represent their interests. As Bill Rusher said, Buchanan was, the ambassador to the right, or whatever it was, for the conservative movement. But when I was going there, the decision had been made. Nixon had announced it in July, and now we were in February before the New Hampshire primary. And it was going to be a tremendously interesting trip, and it was an important trip. And so by then, I was reconciled to the idea that, after all, they elected the president, not me. I thought it was risky. And so we got there, and initially I was doing fine with it until I read the communique. I had not been allowed to participate at all in the writing of the communique. I think Kissinger had done it. And when I saw it, and Rose Woods and I were appalled by it.
Who was Rose Woods?
Rose Woods was the most loyal Nixonite there was. She was with him she came with him right after the Hiss case in 1948. Had been with him when I was there. She, at 18 years, was family to the Nixons. A great lady, loyal, courageous, and went through every single one of those crises, and then some with Richard Nixon.
So you're on your way back from China.
We're on the way back from China, and so Kissinger had gotten word. I thought the Shanghai communication was a sellout of Taiwan, and frankly, was a shallow piece of work, concessions all through it, and it embarrassed me. It almost made me ashamed. So he came back to discuss it. Said, what's your problems with the communiques? I said, look here, Chinese open with a statement about revolution, what we want, and we start off with some examination of conscience. I said, the Japanese, they say Japan is militaristic. And we don't defend our own ally. And the part on Taiwan, we basically accept their position. And so I said, it's a sellout. It was badly written. You should have had me in there. I would like to have written it. I could have, we could have stated our side, they state their side. And so then he went forward, and he came back, and Henry started ragging me, the conservative, you and your conservative friends, they haven't supported us in the Middle East. And we had. So I started answering, and then I just got up and just put my face about that far from his and yelled BS in the vernacular. And sat down. If you can believe it, I looked over, there was Brent Scowcroft grinning away. Thumbs up. I think he enjoyed, I don't know that he agreed with me at all, but I think he enjoyed the encounter.
Why did you say you were going to resign?
That's why, because I felt that, I'd grown up being taught and learning that the worst diplomatic disaster in American history was Yalta, where FDR had signed over basically the freedom of those 10 countries in Eastern Europe to the Soviet Union and Joe Stalin to their custody, and it was a horror show. And I'd always believed that. It was a horrendous betrayal. And I said to myself, look, if I've been party to something that's going to do the same thing to the people of Taiwan, whom we supported. Taiwan, we always supported our allies, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. And so I just felt ashamed and disgusted, and I decided to resign, and told my parents when I got home, and sent word to Florida, Key Biscayne, that I wanted to come down and resign. And thankfully, Haldeman argued against it, and Rose Woods said don't do it, and others said don't do it. I think the president in there, according to Haldeman, was quite prepared. Initially, he wanted to tell me not to do it, but finally he said if he's going to go, he's going to go. I remember, and it reminded me of my friend Dick Whalen, who walked out at Mission Bay after Nixon's inauguration, or Nixon's nomination, Miami Beach in '68. And he was a great writer and a friend of mine. He walked out of Mission Bay and sent a letter to the president. Shelley picked one up, Rose Woods, but resigning. And I ran to Nixon and says, this guy's such a great writer, we've got to get him back. Nixon said, if he's going to resign now, let him go. I mean, if that's the way he feels, let him go. Very cold about it. That better that he go now than that he go in the middle of the campaign and really have an explosion. So I think Nixon had come to the conclusion that if I wanted to go that badly, maybe I can go over to the campaign or somewhere else, but I should go.
Why didn't you go?
I decided by the weekend, I said, I've made my case to the president, to Haldeman, to Kissinger, to everybody in the building knows what I believe and what I feel, and I want Nixon to be reelected, and so what am I going to accomplish by walking out? Because I'm not going to have a big press conference or anything. I'm just going to slip out. And a friend of mine left the administration, Bill Gavin. He came to see me. He's the late Bill Gavin, wonderful guy, working for USIA. I think went over to work for Jim Buckley after that.
This is from your book on page 175. Henry lost it. Minutes later, Sally was back in my office. Quote, "I can't take this," she said. "I just watched Dr. Kissinger throw all the pages I gave him across the room, and there's a 2-star general crawling around on the floor picking them up," unquote.
That's my secretary, Sally Brinkerhoff, currently Sally Hartwig. I just got an email from her and talking about all those days after she had read the book. What this was is that after the Cambodian speech and Cambodia and Kent State and the huge explosion that took place, Nixon sent the troops into Cambodia for 60 days and 30 kilometers. And he wanted a long paper presented on what we had accomplished with that. And the NSC produced a paper of, I guess, some 6,000 words. So Nixon told me, and Haldeman told me through Nixon, he wants you to rewrite it. And so Henry, as was his custom, would hold off his material for long enough so that you couldn't rewrite it and get it in. So he held it off, and it was 6,000. It was given to me in the afternoon out in San Clemente. And Sally and I went to work on that, and I rewrote these 6,000 words all night long. And it was about 8 in the morning that I got them all done and sent them down. Sally said, "Take it on down to Dr. Kissinger's office." And that's what she came back and told me. It had gone right across the room. But the odd thing is, and Nixon, as Haldeman writes, he loved what the job I had done, putting, these items up, bullet points of all the weapons captured from the North Vietnamese, their casualties, exactly how many rockets and mortars, ammunition, and really made the case with the documents and facts and information, made it well instead of one of these long meandering things that you got out of the NSC. And Nixon said, I want all the papers done in this form after this, and he thought it was terrific. So I felt very, very good about it after reading Haldeman's memoirs.
You've got lots of memoirs in here. At a couple points I'm thinking, this is Patrick J. Buchanan's revenge. He's waited all these years to publish all these memos to say, "See, I was right back then."
Well, were you always right? I mean, I was stunned by the China trip. But all these things, there's a certain consistency. But you're right, I have held those for a long time in my files and everything. And they really represent what I believed in. There's a thread of consistency, certainly on political strategy all the way up through. It worked. It worked. The idea of put the Goldwater people together with the Nixon center of the party, and goodbye to Rockefeller and them. And then once you get this block, go after the Northern Catholics in the Democratic Party, folks that were raised just like me. And Nixon raised his Catholic vote from 22% against Jack Kennedy to 55% in government. And you get this, what we call the Southern Protestants, they now call the evangelicals, or they denounced as a Southern strategy. All these natural allies of ours on politics issues, the Southern conservatives, and put these 4 blocks together. And as I write, it's going to split the country a bit, but we're going to wind up with the larger half, which we did. Can you imagine? And anybody thinking in 1962, after Nixon's last press conference, 10 years later, he would win a 49-state landslide? And then it all came apart. As I said, we rolled the rock all the way up the mountain, and it rolled right back down on top of us.
When did you first personally think there was a recording system? And when did you first learn about the recording system in the Oval Office and on the phones?
I don't believe I thought there was a recording system. I first learned about it when Alexander Butterfield testified. That was in July of 1973. He came up and testified that there was a recording system in the Oval Office. And I reflected on that, and I knew the times that, the president had called me and late at night, and he had conversations where we were joking about various people, and he was sort of letting his hair down. And so I wrote him a memo saying, I think you ought to, Dean had testified, you're going to have to keep the Dean tapes, the 5 tapes of conversations with Dean. I didn't think they were going to be that damaging to us. And keep the tapes with Brezhnev and the foreign policy stuff, the stuff you need, you really should tape. And I said, take the rest out and burn it and shut down this special prosecutor's office now before this thing grows into a monster. And I didn't know it at the time, but Nixon had called in Haig and Fred Bazard and entertained this idea that he should burn the tapes, and they said, well, it'll be obstruction of justice. First, I didn't recommend burning subpoenaed tape. Secondly, they were his property. There was executive privilege existed. Everybody knew it. And if he simply got rid of them as a fait accompli and just said, in effect, impeach and be damned, I think he would have moved right through it. And President Nixon said in his memoirs, if he had burned the tapes, as I'd urged him to do, that he would have survived. And I think that's right.
Here's some video from Peter Jennings was a very young man at this time, anchor on ABC. Just a little bit back in May 9th, 1970. It's the buses circling the White House that you write about in your book. Let's watch this.
Okay.
They streamed through every street of Washington heading south. Bumper-to-bumper buses served as silent sentries to guard the immediate area near the White House. The demonstrators kept coming through the morning. The intent was serious, the mood was peaceful, and the day was hot.
Why the buses, and how many were there, and whose idea was it?
Well, this is May 9th. This was the Cambodia-Kent State speech, or Cambodia speech, where I'd worked with the president on, where we invaded Cambodia. It was a tremendous shock to clean out the communist sanctuaries in Cambodia from which they were attacking Americans in South Vietnam. And there was an explosion on the campuses, and there was riots. And out in Kent State, there was a riot in Kent on Saturday night. National Guard came out Sunday. They burned the ROTC building. Monday, there was a huge demonstration. And the Guard fired live ammunition and killed 4 students. And that exploded the campuses in the country. And virtually, there were hundreds and hundreds of campuses that simply shut down. And this was early May. And Nixon was tremendously shaken by this because he had made this statement that Nixon had come out of the Pentagon after the day 1, I think it was May 1, right after the speech. And a woman said, it was either her son or husband, I want to thank you, Mr. President, for what you're doing to keep, to help my husband stay alive over there. And Nixon said, they're great young people over there. You should see them. They're terrific. On the other hand, there are these bums blowing up campuses. And the term bums was taken by the press for Nixon to mean all the demonstrators and all the people that opposed the war. And then the killing of the 4 students at Kent State, and this just exploded. And so the crowds coming into D.C., and Nixon had a press conference there. He had a press conference Friday night, and then he went out that night, and I remember the phrase, searchlights on the lawn. Nixon was about 3 or 4 a.m., went out on the lawn with Manolo, the man that worked for him up in New York, and he took him over to the Lincoln Memorial, and there were students wandering around. Here comes the President of the United States at 4 or 5 in the morning. And Nixon tried to start a conversation with him, and some of them said he was talking football. Others said, so Nixon sent around to his speechwriters a memo of what he tried to communicate, what he had tried to say. But that was the worst period. I call it the Gethsemane of the Nixon presidency before Watergate. He was really down and really broken. I've got memos in there from Pat Moynihan. To me, they were just semi-panic from Moynihan, saying you got to take control of all the National Guard units in the country, your commander-in-chief, and put U.S. Army officers in charge, and doing all these things. And so, but there's no doubt of it, Nixon was affected by this, and the staff, many in the staff, Bill Safire denounced the speech in his memoirs, as did Henry Kissinger, although Haldeman says Kissinger had heard the speech and complimented the president before he delivered it. So I just tell that whole story, and I've got a line in there, which is, I'm not sure, I believe it was that demonstration where I told somebody, I said I was on the first floor of the EOB, my office, I said, I went down to get a pack of cigarettes and ran into the 82nd Airborne. But I went down there when there were all these kids down there, these paratroopers. They were sitting there looking around. And they're about, I would say about 10 years younger than me. And I tell you, their demonstrators are lucky they didn't get through those buses and try to run into the White House. They would have gotten, they would have met some real force.
How many more books do you think you'll write?
I don't, people have asked me to write another book. And, I'm just not sure. I'm not sure. I don't know exactly. Once I got this done, I've thought of doing a slim book on with Reagan. I just don't. I think, as the man said, I've said what I came to say.
So you've done everything you wanted to do.
Well, yeah, I feel I'm very fortunate being around still. You mentioned, by the way, in here that you had open heart surgery at one point. Sure, it was right after the California primary in 1992. That's why guys said, "Why are you staying in the brace?" It's because the doctor told me I've got to go in for open heart surgery right after the primaries. That you couldn't last. This was the surgery you had that made me so nervous when I gave that, culture war speech in the convention. Whether I could really had the energy to do it. So yeah.
What was wrong with the heart?
The heart valve was leaking badly, very, very bad, and it started to deteriorate. The doctor would describe it. He said it'll get worse, 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 and suddenly it'll take a turn down like that, and you get the valve in just as it makes the turn.
You mentioned Bill Safire earlier, and I want to show folks Bill Safire just talking about the writing, and the New York Times hired him to be a columnist, and I want you to put him in context with your brand of conservatism.
Okay.
He's like a layer cake, and the top layer is a patriot, and beneath that there's mild paranoia, and beneath that there's very good to people who work with him, and thoughtful and not at all abusive, and underneath that a hardliner.
I mean, he was a wordsmith and wrote speeches and then did his column in the New York Times. Where were the two of you on the political spectrum?
Well, Bill Safire was regarded when he came aboard as, but he had been with Nixon in 1960, and Bill was one of the people, 4 or 5 people. When I went to New York, he said, "You got to go see Vic Lasky, you got to go see Bill Safire, come down here, see Sandy Quinn, Agnes Waldron," people who were really loyalists, who were considered people that he talked to, and they ought to come to know me. My read on Safire was that he was basically a New York liberal Republican, very comfortable with Rockefeller, Lindsay, and Nixon. He had worked for Nixon, was loyal to him personally. He was a wordsmith and a writer, but he was on the other side from me in all the arguments, and whether it's busing and things like that. And I was basically very close to being a solid Goldwater conservative. And Ray Price and Safire were regarded as, I would say, moderate liberal Republicans. And I remember when Bill Safire was hired at the end of Nixon's first term, frankly, I think partly due to the Agnew speech, telling all these liberal newspapers were all biased and overwhelming. And so the New York Times decided they needed a conservative, and so they hired Bill Safire, and Sulzberger said, we needed a conservative on the page. And so we put that, and it was in the news summary that Bill had been hired. And Nixon wrote a little note, Buchanan and Haldeman, "Safire a conservative? Somebody tell Human Events." So we all had a great laugh at that. But Bill went on to win a Pulitzer Prize. But as a social conservative, no. On economics, Bill was the one that worked on the speech, the famous speech where wage and price controls all the things, the big end of Bretton Woods going off the gold standard. He went up to campaign. It was a great opportunity and a great moment.
Here's a moment you also write about. This is at Pat Nixon's funeral in 1993. It's only about 20 seconds.
He felt a tremendous sense of loss because he depended on Pat. She was a very strong woman, and she never did leave him or turn her back on him in any of the controversial things he was involved in. She stuck with him, and he leaned on her and depended on her.
You worked closely with her in 1966.
Oh, she's a great lady.
But what did you see in Pat Nixon that none of the rest of us saw? And what did she do? The two of you were working together.
Well, she was so down to earth. She called herself Miss Ryan, and she would answer and her name's Thelma Pat Ryan Nixon. So she was in the same little office with Rose Woods and me, and these people would call up. I remember one of them called up and said, "I'd like to talk to Vice President Nixon." And she said, "Well, he's busy right now, I can't." And she said, "I'm a personal friend of Pat Nixon." And Mrs. Nixon would tell us that, and she smoked. And I was a chain smoker then, and so when I ran out of cigarettes, she goes, "Mrs. Nixon, you got a couple of Marlboros so I can go get a..." But she was a wonderful lady. I think she was a very strong lady. She had a good sense of humor, and she was a realist, and you know, I just liked her very much. And I remember after I testified, Watergate testimony came off so well, and the president said, "Come on over to the mansion." You know, right after I testified, about 5 or 6 o'clock or so, I was having a party in my office. And so I went over there, and she comes running up, and she waltzes me all around the room after I testified. But she was reserved, but she was a great lady. Julie's written a wonderful book about her, just a wonderful book about her.
What did you think of the media coverage of her? And over your lifetime, when do you recognize that the media is being against somebody in politics? What's the giveaway?
Well, do you mean how was she treated?
Yes.
Well, I think it was simplistic and sort of plastic Pat, that she just stands there behind him and doesn't move and maintains the same posture or facial expression, and that wasn't her at all. When do you discover that the media? I mean, when Nixon, I first went to work with Nixon. It was early '66, and as Sapphire says, regularly he would say the press is the enemy. Now remember that, you know. And I'd been going to journalism school. I worked at the Globe Democrat. A lot of the reporters and others were, you know, liberals and moderates, and a few conservatives and things. And I just didn't believe they were the enemy. I knew Nixon had gotten a horrible press for years. But I think that even all of us, you take Ray Price, who was it was with the Herald Tribune, and I think a lot of them came to believe they really had it in for Nixon. You know, who was that intellectual, I quote in there, the fellow who said, you know, you cannot be an intellectual member of the intelligentsia in New York and have voted for Richard Nixon. You just cannot be that. I didn't understand it. I think he was a progressive Republican in domestic policy. He did run a populist, you know, small c conservative campaign, law and order, things like that. But he was an internationalist, not a globalist. And all of these things, they were not that different from Kennedy's positions, you know, Jack Kennedy's. And indeed, in some ways, Kennedy was more conservative, I think, in terms of, you know, bear any burden and all the rest of it. And yet there was just a hostility to Nixon that I have never seen before, and until we get to Trump. And of course, President Trump fights differently. Where the president brooded, Trump just fights back daily.
Got a piece of tape that I got to show you. We're close to the end of this.
Sure.
I don't know if you remember this. This is October the 24th, 1999. See if you remember this.
Tomorrow, Pat Buchanan is announcing that he will be a candidate for the presidency on the Reform Party.
I just think it's ridiculous. I mean, he wrote a book because, look, he's a Hitler lover. I guess he's an anti-Semite. He doesn't like the blacks. He doesn't like the gays. It's just incredible that anybody could embrace this guy. And maybe he'll get 4 or 5% of the vote, and it'll be a really staunch, right, wacko vote. I'm not even sure if it's right. It's just a wacko vote. And I just can't imagine that anybody can take him seriously.
What do you think when you see that?
Well, that's when we announced, I thought we could beat Trump for the nomination, and I think we could.
The Reform Party.
Reform Party, and we got the nomination. But I look upon those with Trump, you found out those are really terms of endearment. I mean, I look at that, and I do laugh, but I will say this reveals something that a number of years ago, I got a call from Donald Trump, and he was very gracious and mentioned some things he had said way back there, and said he regretted them, was very gracious about it, and And so, you know, I supported him almost 100%, supported a lot of his positions, was elated that he came out with those positions. I voted for him in the Virginia primary. I voted for him in the general election. And so I hope the president's a success.
Who's more honest in the public light, Donald Trump or Pat Buchanan?
That's what the nuns told me how to behave. What did you say? Who's more honest?
Who's more honest? Pat Buchanan? I mean, when you said what you said, how often were you not telling the truth, and how often is he not telling the truth?
I don't think Trump. I think Trump says what he believes and tweets what he believes.
He believe you were a Hitler follower?
No, I think he was. Well, it's what he felt at the time. I think that was partly motivated by the fact that if he had designs on the Reform Party nomination, that he was out of the race, and it might have looked like, I don't know his motives, might look like that I'd gotten in and he wasn't getting in.
He called you a wacko.
Brian, I wish that was the worst thing I've been called.
But have you always, when you've taken points of view and all that, have you always told the truth in politics?
No, and let's say this. Look, when I worked for Richard Nixon, I'm an assistant to the president. And Ronald Reagan, as I said, what you do is I argue for a policy inside, and once the president decides, you got three choices. You go out and defend the policy the president stated, you keep your mouth shut, or you get out. Now, clearly, I would explain policies like, let me give Nixon. I traveled with him to the Middle East 50 years ago, almost exactly at the time of the Six-Day War, and we went through Africa and everything, and he was a critic of Vietnam, of Johnson's policy. He defended it everywhere he was because he saw himself, I think, as almost an attorney for the government of the United States, obligated to defend the policy and explain the policy. And it was really something to behold, and I think he felt good about that. He was great friends with Rusk, or a great admirer of Rusk. And so I think look, let me say this. You don't go out and tell a lie, but you do say, here's why the president's doing this, here's why he thinks the China trip is good. And you don't go out and say, geez, I think this is going to blow up in our face. I mean, you have to, there's certain obligations you got if you're, in effect, we're all attorneys for the man sitting there in the Oval Office, and we're giving the best defense we can. I mean, I wrote the defense. I got it hanging on my wall, the famous Watergate defense. I think it was May 22nd, 1973. All these, and I argued all night with Bazard and Haig. They're going in and out, and I said, this doesn't sound right. But I got a note from President Nixon, was hanging on my wall. It says, Al told me you are a great devil's advocate. Thanks for all you do above and beyond the call of duty. That's the job. It's a great job, Brian. It's not bad at all.
This book is called Nixon's White House Wars, the Battles That Made and Broke a President and Divided America Forever. Our guest has been Patrick J. Buchanan. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Free transcripts, or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at Q&A.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.